comrades. Today we're going to be covering chapters 9 and 10 of Maurice Cornforth's Materialism and the Dialectical Method. So beginning with chapter 9, titled Contradiction. Contradictions inherent in processes. In the last chapter, we considered how qualitative change is brought about by the struggle of opposed forces. This was exemplified equally in the change of a state of a body from liquid to solid or gas, and in the change of society from capitalism to socialism. In each case, there are opposite tendencies at work, whose struggle eventuates in some fundamental transformation, a qualitative change. This struggle is not external and accidental. It is not adequately understood if we suppose that it is a question of forces or tendencies arising quite independently, the one of the other, which happen to meet to bump against each other and come into conflict. No. The struggle is internal and necessary, for it arises and follows from the nature of the process as a whole. The opposite tendencies are not independent the one of the other, but are inseparably connected as parts or aspects of a single whole. And they operate and come into conflict on the basis of the contradiction inherent in the process as a whole. Movement and change result from causes inherent in things and processes, from internal contradictions. Thus, for example, the old mechanist conception of movement was that it only happened when one body bumped into another. There were no internal causes of movement, that is, no self-movement, but only external causes. But on the contrary, the opposed tendencies which operate in the course of the change of state of a body operate on the basis of the contradictory unit of attractive and repulsive forces inherent in all physical phenomenon. Again, the class struggle in capitalist society arises on the basis of the contradictory unit of socialized labor and private appropriation inherent in that society. It does not arise as a result of external causes, but as a result of the contradictions within the very essence of the capitalist system. On the other hand, Tory and right-wing labor theoreticians make out that the class struggle is stirred up by external interference, by communist agitators and Soviet agents. And they believed that if only this external interference could be stopped, the system would get along very well as it is. The internal necessity of the struggle of opposed forces and of its outcome, based on the contradictions inherent in the process as a whole, is no mere refinement of philosophical analysis. It is of very great practical importance. Bourgeois theorists, for example, are well able to recognize the fact of class conflicts in capitalist society. What they do not recognize is the necessity of this conflict, that it is based on contradictions inherent in the very nature of the capitalist system, and that, therefore, the struggle can only culminate in the end with the destruction of the system itself and its replacement by a new, higher system of society. So they seek to mitigate the class conflict, to tone it down and reconcile the opposing classes, or to stamp it out, and so to preserve the system intact. Precisely this bourgeois view of the class conflict is brought into the labor movement by social democracy. It was in opposition to such a shallow metaphysical way of understanding class conflict that Lenin pointed out in The State and Revolution. It is often said and written that the core of Marxist theory is the class struggle, but it is not true. To limit Marxism to the theory of the class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something which is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. A Marxist is one who extends the acceptance of the class struggle to the acceptance of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is where the profound difference lies between a Marxist and an ordinary petty or even big bourgeois. This is the touchstone on which the real understanding and acceptance of Marxism should be tested. In general, contradiction is inherent in a given process. The struggle which is characteristic of the process is not an external clash of accidentally opposed factors, but is the working out of contradictions belonging to the very nature of the process. And this conditions the outcome of the process. Contradiction consists of the unity and struggle of opposites. The key conception of dialectics is this conception of contradiction inherent in the very nature of things, that the motive force of qualitative changes lies in the contradictions contained within all processes of nature and society, and that in order to understand, control, and master things in practice, we must proceed from the concrete analysis of their contradictions. What exactly do we mean by contradiction? According to the common metaphysical conception, contradictions occur in our ideas about things, but not in things. We can assert contradictory propositions about a thing, and then there is a contradiction in what we say about it, but there can be no contradiction in the thing. This point of view regards contradiction simply and solely as a logical relation between propositions, but does not consider it as a real relation between things. Such a point of view is based on considering things statically, as fixed and frozen, disregarding their motions and dynamic interconnections. If we consider the real complex movements and interconnections of real complex things, then we find that contradictory tendencies can and do exist in them. For example, if the forces operating in a body combine tendencies of attraction and of repulsion, that is a real contradiction. And if the movement of society combines the tendency to socialize production with the tendency to preserve private appropriation of the products, that is a real contradiction too. The existence of contradictions in things is a very familiar state of affairs. There is nothing in the least abstruse about it, and it is often referred to in everyday conversations. For example, we speak of a man as having a contradictory character, or as being a mass of contradictions. This means that he evinces opposed tendencies in his behavior, such as gentleness and brutality, recklessness and cowardice, selfishness and self-sacrifice. Or again, contradictory relations are the subject of everyday gossip when we talk about married couples who are always quarreling but never happy apart. Such examples show that when we speak in Marxist philosophy about contradictions in things, we are not inventing some far-fetched philosophical theory, but are referring to something which is familiar to everyone. Nor are we using the word contradiction in some new and strange sense of our own, but are using the word in its ordinary, everyday sense. A real contradiction is a unity of opposites. There is a real contradiction inherent, as we say, in the very nature of a thing or process or relationship, when in that thing or process or relationship, opposite tendencies are combined together in such a way that neither can exist without the other. In the unity of opposites, the opposites are held together in a relation of mutual dependence, where each is the condition of existence for the other. For example, the class contradictions between workers and capitalists in capitalist society is just such a unity of opposites, because in that society neither can the workers exist without the capitalists, nor the capitalists without the workers. The nature of the society is such that these opposites are held together in inseparable unity. This unity of opposites belongs to the very essence of the social system. Capitalism is a system in which capitalists exploit workers and workers are exploited by capitalists. It is the unity of opposites in a contradiction which makes inescapable and necessary the struggle of opposites. Since the opposed terms are inseparably united, there is no getting out of the struggle. Thus, for example, because opposed classes are united in capitalist society, the development of that society proceeds and cannot but proceed in the form of a class struggle. We may also speak of the interpretation of opposites in a contradiction. For being united in struggle, each opposed tendency is in its actual character and operation at any phase of the struggle influenced, modified, or penetrated by the other in many ways. Each side is always affected by its relation with the other. The working out of contradictions. We can only understand and can only control and master the processes of nature and society by understanding their contradictions and the consequences of those contradictions, the way they work out. Contradiction is the driving force of change. So if we want to understand how things change and to control and utilize their changes, then we must understand their contradictions. Why should we say that contradiction is the driving force of change? It is because it is only the presence of contradictions in a process which provides the internal conditions making change necessary. A process which contained no contradictions would simply go on in the same way until some external force stopped it or modified it. A movement without contradictions would be continuous repetition of the same movement. It is the presence of contradictions that is that is, of contradictory tendencies of movement, or of a unity and struggle of opposites, which brings about changes of movement in the course of a process. Imagine, if you can, a society without contradictions. This would be a society in which, by continuing to do the same things in the same ways, people would satisfy all their needs. Such a society would never change. There would continually be movement in it, inasmuch as people would be doing things all the time, but the movement would always be the same. There would be a process, but a process of repetition. However, no such society exists or ever could exist, because from the very nature of the conditions of human life, there must always be contradictions in society. By satisfying their needs, people create new unsatisfied needs, and by advancing their forces of production, they bring about a state of affairs in which they need to change their social relations and institutions correspondingly. This is why changes happen in society. The social process is not a process of repetition, but a process in which new things happen. Again, some metaphysical materialists tried to represent the universe as a system of particles bumping into and bouncing off one another. Such a universe would be a universe of the continuous motion of particles, but it would be a universe of the continuous repetition of the same motion. The real universe is not like this because it is full of contradictions. The contradictions of attraction and repulsion, studied by physics, of the association and dissociation of atoms, studied by chemistry, of the processes of life and the relationship of organism with environment, studied by biology. It is the working out of these contradictions in their specific forms, in specific processes, which makes up the real changing processes of the real changing world. This shows that where contradictions exist, there follows the working out of those contradictions, the working out of the struggle of opposites which arises from the unity of opposites. A process is the working out of its own essential contradictions. The universality and particularity of contradictions. Contradiction is a universal feature of all processes, but each particular kind of process has its own particular contradictions, which are characteristic of it and different from those of other processes. This point was underlined by Mao Zedong in his essay on contradiction, which remains one of the most suggestive analysis of the conception yet contributed to Marxist literature. He called it the distinction between the universality and the particularity of contradiction. We can never deduce what will happen in any particular case or how a particular process can be controlled from the universal idea of contradiction. As has already been stressed, the dialectical method does not consist in applying some preconceived scheme to the interpretation of everything, but consists in basing conclusions only on the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Each kind of process has its own dialectic, which can be grasped only by the detailed study of that particular process. The dialectic of the subatomic world is not the same as that of the bodies directly perceptible to our senses. The dialectic of living organisms is not the same as that of the processes of inorganic matter. The dialectic of human society is a new law of motion, and each phase of human society brings with it again its own particular dialectic. Thus, for example, the contradiction between tendencies of attraction and repulsion in physical motion and between the interests of classes in society are both contradictions. This is evidence of the universality of contradiction, but each has its own distinctive character, different from that of the other. This is evidence of the particularity of contradiction. We cannot learn either the laws of physics or the laws of society if we try to deduce them from the universal idea of contradiction. We can learn them only by investigating physical and social processes. Physical movements and the movement of people in society are quite different forms of movement, and so the contradictions studied by social science are different and work out in a different way from those studied by physics. Social and physical processes are similar in that each contains contradictions, but dissimilar in the contradictions each contains. The contradictions characteristic of each kind of process may be called the essential contradictions of that kind of process. For instance, contradictions between attractive and repulsive forces are essential contradictions of physical processes, and contradictions between forces of production and relations of production are essential contradictions of social processes. If we further consider the essential contradictions characteristic of different kinds of processes, then we can further say that these are manifested in specific ways in specific instances of processes of a given kind. For example, the essential contradictions of social processes are manifested in specific ways in each specific social formation. The contradiction between forces of production and relations of production takes specific forms in different formations of society. Thus, in capitalist society, it takes the specific capitalist form of contradiction between the increasingly social character of production and the retention of private appropriation. Again, the relations between any species of living organism and its environment are contradictory. The organism lives only by means of its environment, and at the same time, its environment contains threats to its life which it has continually to overcome. In the case of man, this contradiction takes the form of the specific contradictory relation between man and nature. And this relation itself takes even more specific forms with each stage of man's social development. Man is a part of nature and lives by means of nature, and man lives by opposing himself to nature and subduing nature to his will. This contradictory relation itself develops and takes specific forms as man develops. It is present in both primitive communism and in communism, for example, but presents a different aspect in the latter from the former. In order to understand a process, then, and to learn how to control and master it, we must get to know its essential contradictions and investigate the specific forms they take in specific instances. The outcome of contradictions. The unity of opposites in a contradiction is characterized by a definite relation of superiority-inferiority, or of domination between the opposites. For example, in a physical unity of attraction and repulsion, certain elements of attraction or repulsion may be dominant in relation to others. The unity is such that one side dominates the other, or in certain cases, they may be equal. Any qualitative state of a process corresponds to a definite relation of domination. Thus, the solid, liquid, and gaseous states of bodies correspond to different domination relationships in the unity of attraction and repulsion characteristic of the molecules of bodies. Similarly, in the contradictions of capitalist society, the element of private appropriation plays a dominant role in relation to its opposite, social production, and the capitalist class dominates over the working class. If these domination relationships become reversed, then that marks a qualitative change, the ending of the capitalist state of society, the beginning of a new state. Domination relationships are obviously, by their very nature, impermanent and apt to change, even though in some cases they remain unchanged for a long time. If the relationship takes the form of equality or balance, such balance is by nature unstable, for there is a struggle of opposites within it which is apt to lead to the domination of one over the other. And then if one dominates over the other, the struggle of opposites contains the possibility of the position being reversed. The unity of opposites, said Lenin, is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of opposites is absolute. That is obviously true. Whatever the domination relationship in the unity of opposites may be, it is always apt to change, as a result of which the former unity of opposites will be dissolved and a new unity of opposites take its place. The outcome of the working out of contradictions is, then, a change in the domination relation with characteristic of the initial unity of opposites. Such a change constitutes a change in the nature of a thing, a change from one state to another, a change from one thing to another, a change entailing not merely some external alteration, but a change in the internal character and laws of motion of a thing. It is precisely such a change that we mean by a qualitative change. For instance, if a piece of iron is painted black and instead we paint it red, that is merely an external alteration, affecting the way it reflects light and so its appearance to a seeing eye. But it is not a qualitative change in the sense that we are here defining. On the other hand, if the iron is heated to melting point, then this is such a qualitative change, and it comes about precisely as a change in the attraction-repulsion relationship characteristic of the internal molecular state of the metal. The metal passes from the solid to the liquid state. Its internal character and laws of motion become different in certain ways. It undergoes a qualitative change. Qualitative change is the result of a change in the balance of opposites. Such a change is prepared by a series of quantitative changes affecting the domination relation in the unity of opposites. As the domination relation changes, quantitative change passes into qualitative change. When such a fundamental or qualitative change comes about as a result of the dissolution of an old form of unity or of opposites and the coming into being of a new one, then the opposites themselves change. The side which passes from being dominated over to being dominant is changed in that process, and so is the other side, which passes from being dominant to being dominated over. Hence, in the new qualitative state, there are not the same old opposites in a changed relation, but because the relation is changed, the opposites held together in that relation are changed too. There is a new unity of opposites, a new contradiction. When, for instance, the working class becomes stronger than the capitalist class and from being dominated over becomes dominant, then in the new qualitative state of society, the capitalist class disappears, for the dominant working class deprives it of its conditions of existence. And the working class, existing in completely new conditions, becomes virtually a new class. The contradictions of society therefore change, the particular contradictions of the old state disappear, and new contradictions are born. The struggle between the working class and the capitalist comes to an end, and new kinds of struggle begin. External and internal causes of qualitative change. How far is the passage from quantitative to qualitative change determined by the working out of the contradiction inherent in the process itself, or by internal causes, and how far is it determined by external or accidental causes? It is determined by both, but in different ways. Both in nature and society, different things are always interacting and influencing each other. Hence, external causes must always play a part in the changes which happen to things. At the same time, the character of the change always depends on internal causes. This problem was discussed by Mao Zedong in his essay on contradiction. He concluded, "Contradiction within a thing is the basic cause of its development, while the relationship of a thing with other things, their interconnection and interaction, is a secondary cause. External causes are the condition of change, and internal causes the basis of change, external causes becoming operative through internal causes." Consider, for example, such an event as the hatching of a chicken. The chicken does not develop inside the egg unless heat is applied from the outside. But what develops in the egg, what hatches out, depends on what is inside the egg. As Mao remarks, "In a suitable temperature, an egg changes into a chicken, but there is no temperature which can change a stone into a chicken, the fundamentals of the two things being different." Again, water does not boil unless it is heated, but the boiling process resulting from the application of heat comes about on the basis of the internal contradiction of attraction and repulsion characteristic of the molecules of water. Similarly, in society, a revolution does not proceed without the intervention of external causes, but its character and outcome, and indeed the fact that it happens at all, depend on internal causes. Thus, the basis of the Russian Revolution lay in the contradictions within Russian society. These made the revolution inevitable and determined its character. But what actually set off the revolution in 1917 was something external, the conditions brought about by the imperialist war. In general, if we consider qualitative changes, then their qualitative character can be explained only by the operation of internal causes. The particular contradictions on which the old quality was based determine what new quality emerges. The external causes affect only the quantitative changes of things, the times and places of their beginning, and the rate at which they proceed. Purely external causes can only lead to changes in size and quantity, but cannot explain why things are qualitatively different in 1,001 ways and why things change into one another. Mao Zedong on contradiction. Thus, for example, the class struggle in capitalist society may be speeded up or slowed down by a variety of particular external causes. but the existence of the class struggle, its continuation, its direction, and its final outcome are determined by the contradictions inherent in the capitalist system. The suddenness and gradualness of qualitative change. Qualitative change being the outcome of the working out of contradictions, it follows that the whole process of the struggle of opposites may be regarded as a process of the replacement of one quality by another, of an old quality by a new one. The old quality corresponds to the dominance of one element in the unity of opposites. The reversal of this dominance leads to the replacement of the old quality by the new. In this sense, each element in a unity of opposites is the bearer of a distinct quality. The struggle of the one to maintain its dominance is what maintains the old quality. The struggle of the other to reverse this dominance is what brings into being the new quality replacing the old. For instance, all life is a unity of opposites, of processes of the building up and breaking down of living matter. So long as the building up maintains itself with this unity, life remains. When, however, the opposite begins to dominate, then death commences. Again, if we consider the contradictions of capitalist society, then it is evident that the capitalist state of society depends on private appropriation dominating social production, and the capitalist class dominating the working class. It is the struggle of the working class against the capitalist class and the struggle of free social production from the fetters of private appropriation, which the reversal of the old state happens, brings about a new socialist state of society. It has already been pointed out that every contradiction has its own specific character, and so the struggle of opposites has in every case also its own specific character according to the particular contradiction from which it arises. It follows that processes of qualitative change, replacements of old by new qualities, have also each their own specific character according to the qualities concerned. What is universally true is simply that qualitative change comes about as the working out of contradictions, as an outcome of quantitative change. But this universal truth does not tell us how any particular change will work out. We can only discover that by knowing each particular case. Thus, considering the workings out of different kinds of social contradictions, which result in qualitative changes in society, each works out differently. For example, the contradiction between the great mass of the people and the feudal lords was worked out in the struggle for the democratic revolution. That between the working class and the capitalist class is worked out in the struggle for socialist revolution. That between the colonies and imperialism is worked out in the national liberation struggle. And that between the working class and peasantry in socialist society in the collectivization and mechanization of agriculture. Whatever the method by which different contradictions work out, a point is always reached where the quantitative aspect of the struggle of opposites within the contradiction has been sufficiently modified for the new quality to emerge. This is the point where qualitative change begins. How it continues depends entirely on the particular character of the contradiction of which it is the outcome, on the particular way the struggle of opposites continues. Qualitative change is always sudden and cannot but be sudden, in the sense that a certain point of quantitative change, in the sense that at a certain point of quantitative change, a new quality emerges which was not present before. That is to say, at this point, new things begin to happen, new causes operate, and new effects are produced, new laws of motion come into operation. This is the so-called qualitative leap, the first appearance of the new which was not there before. Thus, qualitative change is preceded by a process of working up to the emergence of new quality. During this process, contradictions are working out, so to speak, unseen, without manifestation in qualitative change. At the termination of this phase, the phase of the emergence of new quality begins abruptly or suddenly and cannot but do so. For example, when water is heated, a movement takes place which suddenly turns into a boiling process. When a child is growing in the womb, a movement takes place which suddenly turns into the process of birth. In society, movement takes place amongst the classes, conflicts are sharpened, opinions mature, and suddenly there begins a decisive revolutionary change. After that, how qualitative change proceeds, the swiftness or slowness, and, in general, the manner of its completion depends entirely on the circumstances of particular cases. Once a new quality emerges, once it has leaped into being, then a process of new qualitative character begins, in which the new quality gradually supplants the old. While, therefore, qualitative change begins suddenly, it continues gradually. How quickly or how slowly the new supplants the old depends on the nature of the process and the conditions under which it occurs. For instance, physical changes of state, such as water coming to boil, are sudden because a point is suddenly reached when a new thing, steam, begins to be formed. But the conversion of water into steam is a gradual process. It is the same with chemical changes, and it is the same again with qualitative changes in society. A point is reached in the working out of social contradictions where the qualitative change begins, the change from the power of one class to the power of another class, from one system of production relations to another. After that, this change may take longer or shorter time to be completed. Take, for example, the political aspect of social revolutions, that is, the conquest of state power. In the Russian Socialist Revolution, this took place by a single blow, which means comparatively quickly. In a few days, all the decisive positions of power passed into the hands of the working class. In the next round of socialist revolutions, those in the present people's democracies, it took place over a longer period, by a series of steps in which first one and then another position of power was conquered. If we look back to the revolutions through which the bourgeoisie formally won power from the feudal lords, then these took place over a longer period still, often extending over many years. Or, if we consider economic changes, these tend to be comparatively slow, taking place through a series of steps. For instance, capitalist relations, once they emerged in feudal society, extended their scope step by step over a long period. Again, the displacement of capitalism by socialism, once begun, is another gradual process, though it takes place more rapidly than the displacement of feudalism by capitalism. It takes place more rapidly for a definite reason, namely that socialism cannot begin to displace capitalism until after the working class has won state power, and then the power of the state operates to direct and speed up economic change. The change from feudalism to capitalism, on the other hand, generally begins long before the state power passes into the hands of the capitalist class, and meanwhile the feudal state acts rather to slow down than to speed up the change. These examples show that there is a quantitative side to qualitative change, namely the power and speed with which it completes itself. And naturally, under certain unfavorable circumstances, it may never be completed at all. In certain cases, it is possible for the change to begin and then be turned back again and disappear. The dialectical materialist conception of contradiction includes both the suddenness and gradualness of qualitative change. The difference between this conception of change and that of many other philosophies is not that dialectical materialism lays it down that all qualitative changes are sudden, whereas the others say they are gradual. It is that dialectical materialism understands change as coming from the struggle of opposites, from the working out of contradictions, whereas the others overlook or deny this. They suppose that change comes in a smooth way, without conflicts, or else by merely external conflicts. Antagonism and non-antagonism in contradictions. The working out of contradictions always involves one side struggling with and overcoming the other. But according to the nature of the contradiction, this process may take place in different ways. And in society, in particular, a distinction must be drawn between contradictions, the solution of which involves the forcible suppression or destruction of one side by the other, and whose solution does not require such method. The change from capitalism to socialism, for example, takes place through the forcible suppression of the capitalist class by the working class. But the ensuing change from socialism to communism does not require the forcible suppression of anyone. The former change is effected by means of a struggle between mutually antagonistic forces, whereas no such antagonisms have been fought out to effect the latter change. In general, social contradictions are antagonistic when they involve conflicts of economic interest. In such cases, one group imposes its own interests on another, and one group suppresses another by forcible methods. But when conflicts of economic interests are not involved, there is no antagonism and therefore no need for the forcible suppression of any group by any other. Once class antagonisms are done away with in socialist society, all social questions can be settled by discussion and argument. by criticism and self-criticism, by persuasion, conviction, and agreement. Antagonism, therefore, is not the same thing as contradiction, nor is it the same thing as the struggle of opposites within a contradiction. The struggle of opposites is a universal, necessary feature of every contradiction, and it may take an antagonistic form or it may not, depending on the particular nature of the particular contradiction. So Lenin remarked that antagonism and contradiction are utterly different. Under socialism, antagonism disappears, but contradiction remains. And that is critical notes on Bukharin's Economics of the Transition Period. As Mao Zedong put it, antagonism is only one form of struggle within a contradiction, but not its universal form. The distinction between antagonism and non-antagonism in the contradictions of society is of great practical importance. There are many contradictions in society, and it is practically important to distinguish which are antagonistic and which are not, in order to find the right method of dealing with them. If a contradiction of the one kind is mistaken for a contradiction of the other kind, then wrong action is taken which cannot lead to the desired results. For example, reformist socialists think there is no need for the working class to take power and use it to suppress the capitalist class, whereas Marxists recognize that capitalism can be ended and socialism achieved by no other method. But when socialism is established, classes and class antagonisms disappear, and so methods of struggle right for the fighting out of class antagonisms are wrong for the ensuing struggle to pass from socialism to communism. Contradictions remain, but since they no longer take the form of antagonism of interests, they do not require for their solution forcible measures to impose the interests of one section upon another. The distinction between antagonism and non-antagonism in contradictions within society is a distinction between those contradictions which can work out only by the use of material force by one side against the other, and those which can work out entirely as a result of discussions among the members of society and agreed decisions taken after such discussion. Contradictions of this last kind are a special kind of contradiction which can arise only among rational human beings, and among them only when they are united in cooperation for a common interest and not divided by antagonistic interests. In such contradictions, there appears the new element of the rational, purposive, consciously controlled working out of contradictions, as opposed to the blind working out of contradictions in nature, the new element of human freedom as opposed to natural necessity. When all means of production are brought fully under planned social direction, then it may be expected that men's mastery over nature will enormously increase, and the conquest and transformation of nature by man will in turn mean profound changes in men's mode of life. For instance, ability to produce an absolute abundance of products with a minimum expenditure of labor, and abolition of the antithesis between manual and intellectual labor clearly imply profound changes in social organization, in outlook, in habits, in mode of life generally. The effecting of such changes cannot but involve at each stage the overcoming of forms of social organization, of outlooks and habits belonging to the past. Development, therefore, will continue to take place through the disclosure of contradictions, the struggle between the new and the old. New needs and new tendencies will arise out of the existing conditions at each stage, which will come into contradiction with the existing forms of social organization and social life, and hence lead to their passing and giving way to new forms. But there is no reason to expect that this development will take place, as hitherto, through violent conflicts and social upheavals. On the contrary, when men understand the laws of their own social organization and have it under their own cooperative control, then it is possible to do away with old conditions and create new conditions in an agreed and planned way without violent conflict or upheaval. Contradiction and the overcoming of the old by the new remains, but the element of antagonism and conflict between men and society disappears and gives way to the properly human method of deciding affairs by scientific appraisal of conditions, needs, and courses of action. Chapter 10. Development and Negation. The forward movement of development. In many processes, the working out of their contradictions results in a directed or forward movement, in which the process moves forward from stage to stage, each stage being in advance to something new, not a falling back to some stage already past. Other processes, however, are not characterized by such a forward movement. For instance, water when cooled or heated undergoes a qualitative change, passes into a new state, ice or steam. But the movement is without direction and cannot be called either progressive or retrogressive. If, for example, we are making tea, then we might call it a move forward to turn water into steam. If we are making iced drinks, then ice is a move forward. The fact is that ice can turn into water and water into steam and back again, and this movement has no direction of its own. When, however, we consider such a movement as that of society, we find that it has a direction of its own. Society moves forward from primitive communism to slavery, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to communism. This is a movement with a direction, a forward movement. Hegel used to think that natural processes were all of the undirected kind, like ice, water, steam, water, ice, and that a direction could only come into processes when spirit or consciousness was at work in them. The changes that take place in nature, he wrote in the introduction to his philosophy of history, however infinitely various they may be, exhibit only a perpetually repeating cycle in nature. There takes place nothing new under the sun. Only in those changes which take place in the region of spirit does anything new arise. But the distinction does not in fact depend on any difference between nature and spirit. A movement can have a direction without any consciousness being present to direct it. Spirit or consciousness itself is a product of nature. Biological changes leading up to man have a direction. So have geological changes. So have processes in the evolution of stars, and so on. In general, direction in processes has a natural explanation. If some processes have direction and others have not, this depends solely on the particular character of the processes themselves and of the conditions under which they happen. In general, since qualitative change in a process is always consequent upon quantitative change, it has a direction when those quantitative changes arises from conditions permanently operating within the process itself, and otherwise it has no direction. It has a direction when, however conditioned by external factors, it is impelled forward by internal causes. In that case, the direction it takes is its own, just because it arises from internal causes. What then is the basis of direction in processes of the internal cause of a forward movement of development? It is to be found in the existence and long-term operation in those processes of essential contradictions which work out by taking a series of specific forms. This is what gives rise to a directed series of stages, a long-term process of development in a definite direction. Thus, for example, if social development has a direction, this arises because man exists in a permanent, contradictory relationship with nature. The permanent existence of this contradiction gives rise to a permanent tendency of man to improve his forces of production, and as this tendency operates so stage by stage, contradictions arise between the social forces of production and the relations of production. The direction of man's social evolution is the direction of man's mastery over nature, and the movement of society takes this direction simply because of the natural conditions of human life, the impulses to change and development which people experience because of the necessity to satisfy their needs. Similarly, if such things as stars pass through a series of evolutionary stages, this is because the contradictory conditions of their existence give rise to continuous processes, such as radiation, the continuation of which brings about a series of qualitative stages in their history. We certainly should not say, as some philosophers have said, that throughout infinite time, the infinite universe develops from stage to stage in a predetermined direction. There is no evidence for any such assertion. Indeed, there is no sense in it. We cannot speak about the direction taken by everything, but only about the direction of the development of particular things in which we are interested. The directed development of things is not due to God or spirit working in them, nor is it the manifestation of some mysterious cosmic law, but it arises and flows from the particular contradictions of particular things. Particular things are characterized by particular contradictions. as a result of which their movement takes a particular direction. The contradiction between old and new, past and future. When there is a forward movement of development in a process, then stage by stage there occurs a transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state, the supplanting of an old quality by a new one. The new stage of development comes into being from the working out of the contradiction inherent in the old, and the new stage itself contains a new contradiction, since it comes into being containing something of the past from which it springs and of the future to which it leads. It has, therefore, its negative and positive sides, a past and a future, something dying away and something developing. On this basis, there once again arises within it the struggle between the old and the new, between that which is dying away and that which is being born, between that which is disappearing and that which is developing. Thus, the forward movement of development is the continuous working out of a series of contradictions. Development continually drives forward to new development. The whole process at each stage is in essence the struggle between the old and the new, that which is dying and that which is being born. To understand the laws of development of anything, we must therefore understand its contradictions and how they work out. A process usually contains not one but many contradictions. It is a knot of contradictions. And so to understand the course of a process, we must take into account all its contradictions and understand their interrelationship. This generally means, first of all, that we must grasp the basic contradiction of a process in its general character and in the specific form it takes at each stage. The basic contradiction is that contradiction inherent in the very nature of the process which determines its direction. Thus, in society, for instance, the basic contradiction is that between the forces of production and the relations of production. And this takes a specific form at each stage of society. In capitalist society, it is the contradiction between social production and private appropriation. This basic contradiction is what determines the direction of development, namely from capitalism to socialism, to social appropriation to match social production. Given the basic contradiction, then a process is characterized by a number of big and small consequential contradictions, the character and effects of which are conditioned by the basic contradiction. The operation and working out of these constitutes the total process of the working out of the basic contradiction towards the emergence of a new stage of the process, a new quality. The basic contradiction works out by the instrumentality of all the struggle arising from all the consequential contradictions. In this, however, one particular contradiction generally plays the key or principal role. In other words, of all the elements, tendencies, or forces entering into various forms of struggle in a knot of contradictions, there is generally one which plays the principal role in working out the basic contradiction to its solution in the realization of a new stage and the supplanting of an old quality by a new one. Within any capitalist country, for example, there are many contradictions. Besides the contradiction between the working class and the capitalist class, there are other contradictions between other classes, the urban petty bourgeoisie, the peasants, the landlords, etc., as well as contradictions within the capitalist class itself. There are also contradictions of an international kind, such as those between a given capitalist country and others, and between imperialists and colonial peoples. But within all this knot of contradictions, it is the struggle of the working class with the capitalist class which, in the given country, plays the key or principal role in carrying society forward from capitalism to socialism. For this is the one contradiction which can work out in such a change from the dominance of one side to that of the other as will bring about a fundamental change in the quality of the whole. Thus, for example, the contradiction between the big capitalists and the petty bourgeoisie always takes the form of domination by the big capitalists, who keep on growing stronger in relation to the petty bourgeoisie, who, for their part, keep on being pressed back and growing weaker. Hence, the petty bourgeoisie cannot be the principal revolutionary force in a capitalist country, and their contradiction with the big capitalists cannot be the principal contradiction. The working class, on the other hand, grows stronger as capitalism develops and is the force which, dominated over by the capitalists, can eventually overthrow this domination. That is why the working class is the principal revolutionary force, and why the contradiction between this class and the capitalists is the principal contradiction. To understand the laws of development of a process, therefore, one must not only understand the basic contradiction of the process at each stage, but also what is the principal force for working out the basic contradiction and carrying the process forward to the next stage. Mao Zedong pointed out that in studying any process, we must do our utmost to discover its principal contradiction. This may be a complex task, since what is the principal contradiction in certain circumstances may not be so in others. But unless we grasp the principal contradiction, we cannot find the crux of a problem and naturally cannot find the method for solving contradictions. This is the method Marx taught us when he studied capitalist society, wrote Mao. Some of the controversy now raging around some of the thoughts of Chairman Mao turns on the question of finding the principal contradiction at the present stage of world social development. Mao has asserted that it is the one between imperialism and national liberation movements. The role of negation in development. The forward movement of development, complex as it may be in each particular case, always takes place through the struggle of the new and the old and the overcoming of the old and dying by the new and rising. Thus, in social development, in the transition from capitalism to socialism, what is new and rising in the economic life of capitalist society, social production, contradicts what is old and carried over from the past, private appropriation, and a new force arises. The working class, whose struggle against the capitalist class is a struggle for the realization of the new stage against the defenders of the old. This dialectical conception of development is opposed to the older liberal conception favored by bourgeois theoreticians. The liberals recognize development and assert that progress is a universal law of nature and society. But they see it as a smooth process, and if they have at times to recognize the existence of struggle, they see it mainly as an unfortunate interruption, more likely to impede development than to help it forward. For them, what exists has not to be supplanted by what is coming into existence. The old has not to be overcome by the new, but it has to be preserved so that it can gradually improve itself and become a higher existence. True to this philosophy, which they took over from the capitalists, the social democrats strove to preserve capitalism with the idea that it can grow into socialism. And thus striving to preserve capitalism, they ended by fighting not for socialism, but against it. These exponents of no struggle and class collaboration cannot avoid struggle. They simply enter into it on the other side. Comparing the dialectical materialists or revolutionary conception of development with this liberal reformist conception, we may say that the one recognizes and embraces, while the other fails to recognize and shrinks from. The role of negation, The role of negation in development. Dialectics teaches us to understand that the new must struggle with and overcome the old, that the old must give way to and be supplanted by the new. In other words, that the old must be negated by the new. The liberal, who thinks metaphysically, understands negation simply as saying no. To him, negation is merely the end of something. Far from meaning advance, it means retreat. Far from meaning gain, it means loss. Dialectics, on the other hand, teaches us not to be afraid of negation, but to understand how it becomes a condition of progress, a means to positive advance. The positive character of negation. Negation in dialectics does not mean simply saying no, wrote Engels in Anti-Düring. When in the process of development the old stage is negated by the new, then, in the first place, that new stage could not have come about except as arising from and in opposition to the old. The conditions for the existence of the new arose and matured within the old. The negation is a positive advance, brought about only by the development of that which is negated. The old is not simply abolished, leaving things as though it had never existed. It is abolished only after it has given rise to the conditions for the new stage of advance. In the second place, the old stage, which is negated, itself constitutes a stage of advance in the forward-moving process of development as a whole. It is negated, but the advance which took place in it is not negated. On the contrary, this advance is carried forward to the new stage, which takes into itself and carries forward all the past achievement. For example, socialism replaces capitalism. It negates it. But the conditions for the rise and victory of socialism were born of capitalism, and socialism comes into existence as the next stage of social development after capitalism. Every achievement, every advance in the forces of production, and likewise every cultural achievement which took place under capitalism is not destroyed when capitalism is destroyed, but on the contrary, it is preserved and carried further. This positive content of negation is not understood by liberals, for whom negation is simply saying no. Moreover, they think of negation as coming only from outside externally. Something is developing very well, and then something else comes from outside and negates it, destroys it. That is their conception. That something by its own development leads to its own negation, and thereby to a higher stage of development, lies outside their comprehension. Thus, the liberals conceive of social revolution not only as a catastrophe, as an end to ordered progress, but they believe that such a catastrophe can be brought about only by outside forces. If a revolution threatens to upset the capitalist system, that is not because of the development of the contradictions of that system itself, but due to its agitators. Of course, there is negation, which takes the form simply of a blow from outside which destroys something. For instance, if I am walking along the road and am knocked down by a car, I suffer negation of a purely negative sort. Such occurrences are frequent both in nature and society. But this is not how we must understand negation if we are to understand the positive role of negation in the process of development. At each stage in the process of development, there arises the struggle of the new with the old. The new arises and grows strong within the old conditions, and when it is strong enough, it overcomes and destroys the old. This is the negation of the past stage of development, of the old qualitative state. It means the coming into being of the new and higher stage of development, the new qualitative state. Negation of negation. This brings us to a further dialectical feature of development, the negation of negation. According to the liberal idea that negation means simply saying no, if the negation is negated, then the original position is restored once more without change. According to this idea, negation is simply a negative, a taken away. Hence, if the negation, the taking away, is itself negated, that merely means putting back again what was taken away. If a thief takes my watch, and then I take it away from him, we are back where we started. I have the watch again. Similarly, if I say, it's going to be a fine day, and you say, no, it's going to be a wet day, to which I reply, no, it's not going to be a wet day, I have simply, by negating your negation, restated my original proposition. This is enshrined in the principle of formal logic, not A equals A. Sorry, let's reread that. This is enshrined in the principle of formal logic, not A equals A. According to this principle, negation of negation is a fruitless proceeding. It just takes you back to where you started. Let us, however, consider a real process of development and the dialectical negation which takes place in it. Society develops from primitive communism to the slave system. The next stage is feudalism. The next stage is capitalism. Each stage arises from the previous one and negates it. So far, we have simply a succession of stages, each following as the negation of the other and constituting a higher stage of development. But what comes next? Communism. Here, there is a return to the beginning, but at a higher level of development. In place of primitive communism, based on extremely primitive forces of production, comes communism based on extremely advanced forces of production, and containing within itself tremendous new potentialities of development. The old, primitive, classless society has become the new and higher classless society. It has been raised, as it were, to a higher power, has reappeared on a higher level. But this has happened only because the old classless society was negated by the appearance of classes and the development of class society, and because finally class society, when it had gone through its whole development, was itself negated by the working class taking power, ending exploitation of man by man, and establishing a new classless society on the foundation of all the achievements of the whole previous development. This is the negation of negation, but it does not take us back to the original starting point. It takes us forward to a new starting point, which is the original one raised, through its negation and the negation of the negation to a higher level. Thus, we see that in the course of development, as a result of a double negation, a later stage can repeat an earlier stage, but repeat it on a higher level of development. The importance of this conception of negation does not lie in its supposedly expressing the necessary pattern of all development. All development takes place through the working out of contradictions. That is a necessary universal law, but specific contradictions do not necessarily work out in such a way that an earlier stage of development is repeated at a later stage. Sometimes that may happen and sometimes not, depending on the specific character of the processes of development. Yet, the repetition of an earlier stage is a notable feature of some processes of development and, moreover, to bring it about is often an important aim of practice. The importance of the conception of negation lies in what it says about the conditions for such repetition. If features of an earlier stage are to be repeated at a later stage, that cannot take place by a simple return to the earlier stage, for that stage is past and cannot come back. It can only take place by their being reproduced at a later stage, in which case they are inevitably changed and modified in accordance with the character of that later change. Thus, features of the past can reappear in the future only as changed and transformed by the process of negation, and not by a simple return to the past. This principle, like other principles of dialectics, has a quality of obviousness which is often overlooked. It is an obvious truth, but it is overlooked by all those who express a hankering to return to the past. Such hankerings must always be vain. It is in practice vitally important to realize that what is past cannot be restored when forward development is in operation. Nevertheless, some features of the past may be restored, but only by carrying forward the process of development to a new stage, in which those features reappear in new ways, on a higher level, as a negation of negation, enriched and transformed as a result of the first negation. We have already seen how the negation of negation occurs in history in the development from primitive communism to communism. The second appearance of communism is only possible after going through the whole development of class society. The first negation, and it embodies all that has been achieved during that development. Again, in the history of thought, the primitive natural materialism of the earliest philosophers was negated by philosophical idealism, and modern materialism arises only as the negation of that negation. This is modern materialism, wrote Engels in Anti-Düring. It is not the merest re-establishment of the old, but adds to the permanent foundations of this old materialism the whole thought content of 2,000 years of development of philosophy and natural science. The practical importance of the negation can be seen most clearly if we take the example of the development of individual property, where it again occurs. Marx, in the first volume of Capital, pointed out that the pre-capitalist individual private property founded on the laborers of the proprietor is negated, destroyed, by capitalist private property. For capitalist private property arises only on the ruin and expropriation of the pre-capitalist individual producers. The individual producer used to own his instruments of production and his product. Both were taken away from him by the capitalists. But when capitalist private property is itself negated, when the expropriators are expropriated, then the individual property of the producers is restored once more, but in a new form, on a higher level. This does not reestablish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, i.e. on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and means of production. The producer, as a participant in socialized production, then enjoys as his individual property a share of the social product, according to his work in the first stage of communist society and according to his needs in the fully developed communist society. When capitalism arose, the only way forward was through this negation of negations. Some of the British Chartists put forward in their land policy demands aimed at arresting the new capitalist process and restoring the old individual private property of the producer. This was in vain. The only road forward for the producers was by the struggle against capitalism and for socialism, not to restore the old individual property which capitalism had destroyed, but to destroy capitalism and to recreate individual property on a new socialist basis. Similarly, the Russian Narodniki, against whom Lenin fought in the 1890s, wanted somehow to arrest the process of capitalist development and restore the old peasant communes. Lenin's fight against them was based on showing that this was impossible. The principle of negation is thus an expression of the simple truth that one cannot put the clock back and reconstitute the past. One can only move forward into the future through the working out of all the contradictions contained within the given stage of development and through the negations consequent on them. All right, so there we have chapters 9 and 10 of Materialism and the Dialectical Method. Some key concepts. There was the unity of opposites, which in itself seems like a contradiction, but as we saw, it is not. It's just the combining of things that are opposite that form those contradictions. There can be many within a mode of production or a stage of society, a stage of development, as we saw, and that those eventually are resolved to create something new. And then going into that negation of negation, still a concept that I'm struggling with, especially in regards to, as a communist, my goal is communism. So what are those contradictions inherent within communism? Because there has to be a unity of opposites. Once communism is achieved, it's not always going to be communism. There's going to be a negation. And I was kind of talking to one of my comrades about this, and he kind of posited the thought, well, okay, if we go back to communism, then the next stage after communism was slavery. So slavery for whom? Well, in a communist society of advanced stage, not the primitive, eventually we might get to the point where we automate everything. So everything is automated, everything is done by robots. So essentially, and if you want to play with this thought a little bit, robots become our slaves. So that kind of begs the point, at one point, is there a point where these robots develop a stage of consciousness? And at that point, that opens up the whole new modes of, okay, well, there's slavery now, and slavery went into feudalism and so on forth with that sort of thing. So it's just a thought to kind of play with, because our goal right now is to get to communism, but there's going to be something after. It's not going to stay around forever. It's not a utopia, and that's something that a lot of people need to understand. It's not going to be a utopia. There's going to be conflict, because that's just inherent in any sort of system. Now, we saw about antagonisms and things of that nature. It might not be, or might be a non-antagonistic sort of thing, but with as many people as there are, I don't think there's any way to get rid of, maybe not on the grand scale, but definitely personal antagonisms. There's still going to be some forms of crime, things of that nature, aggression. That's just it. It's not going to be a utopia, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But that's just some thoughts. Definitely, if you're struggling with any of these terms, listen to the video again or read it by yourself, make notes, listen to other people talking about this, people that are much more educated and have thought about these things for many more years than I have. But there you go. Until next time, thank you.